Welcome to another big train tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at a standard gauge locomotive built in 1920 for the Union Pacific Railroad. After spending its final 20-plus years operating in Wyoming, this railroad workhorse was donated to the museum in 1972. Restored today to its pre-World War II appearance and displayed at the museum in Golden, Union Pacific Steam Switcher number 4455 is a Colorado classic. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today was one of nearly 200 similar steam locomotives built to switch freight and passenger cars around Union Pacific's many yards and terminals system-wide. For over a decade, it was assigned to switching duties in Denver, including Denver Union Station. Then it was sold off to a Wyoming cement plant railroad, where it spent another 2 decades hauling trainloads of rock before coming to the Colorado Railroad Museum. Come join me now as we explore the history of this seemingly unremarkable yet important locomotive. From their inception in the late 1820s and continuing into the 1830s, pioneering railroads in both the United Kingdom and the United States used small locomotives intended for relatively slow speeds. These early steam locomotives were often 040s or 060s in terms of their wheel arrangements. This means that they had no leading wheels to guide them along curved or uneven track, and no trailing wheels either. Their entire weight was placed on the locomotive's main driving axles. In the UK, railroads were typically built to higher standards starting in those early years, featuring stone viaducts, tunnels, and other great works of engineering to limit curves and gradients. Wheel arrangements that sported drivers alone would continue to be found in service on branch lines, while mainline freight and passenger trains would eventually have leading and sometimes trailing axles added to maintain stability while operating at speed. Perhaps the most famous British 060 today is Thomas the Tank Engine. Railroad development in the United States would follow a very different path. As railroads spread in all directions from the eastern seaboard between 1840 and 1870, new wheel arrangements were devised to adapt steam locomotives to the rougher and more hastily built tracks found in America. These new locomotives featured lead or pilot wheels to guide them over uneven trackage and around sharp curves, helping to limit their chances for derailment. The American wheel arrangement, featuring 4 leading wheels and 4 driving wheels with no trailing wheels, became ubiquitous for both freight and passenger trains across the United States from the 1850s through the 1870s. Locomotives continued to grow in size after the completion of America's first transcontinental railroad in 1869. Trailing axles were introduced, allowing larger fireboxes to be fabricated for steam locomotives, which translated into increased pulling power. The idea of a single wheel arrangement that could be used for both freight and passenger trains became impractical, given differing needs for speed versus pulling power. Thus, many new locomotive types were introduced in the late 19th century, specifically intended for either freight or passenger service. But during this same time, railroads discovered they also needed locomotives for a third type of service. Freight yards, passenger coach yards, and major railroad workshop complexes were growing, and smaller but more powerful engines were needed to push and pull locomotives, freight cars, and passenger cars into position for their next duties. Intended to operate at slower speeds, these new switchers, as they became known, were designed with all of their weight supported on relatively small diameter driving wheels. In the late 19th century, major Western railroads, including the Union Pacific, were experimenting with switchers. Especially at major junction points, trains had to be made up and taken apart, and cars shunted to and from nearby industries. Even the much smaller Denver and Rio Grande employed several early 060s, including those converted from smaller freight locomotives. This busy railroad had locomotives operating around the clock at a number of junctions in order to keep up with incoming and outgoing traffic demands. In time, the 060 wheel arrangement would become the most common for switchers in the U.S. The Union Pacific Railroad alone would acquire 190 new 060s between 1887 and 1920. Because the Union Pacific was, for a time, part of the Harriman Empire of railroads, which also included the Southern Pacific, the Illinois Central, and several other lines, many of these switchers would be constructed to Harriman standard designs. These standardized designs also included other locomotives, passenger cars, freight cars, even signage and track components for the combined system. Our subject locomotive would end up being included in Union Pacific's final order for the 060 wheel arrangement. Completed by the Lima Locomotive Works of Lima, Ohio in October 1920, switcher number 4455 was one of 30 identical standard gauge locomotives. The 4455 was actually the second locomotive to have been assigned this number. An earlier group of 060s, built to World War I United States Railway Administration standards in late 1918, were renumbered at this time to clear the roster for this newer and larger order of switchers. Built to burn coal, number 4455, together with its tender, measures 58 feet 7 inches in length. The locomotive weighed just over 125 tons, or 250,000 pounds, in working order, which was typically defined as 2/3 full of water and fuel. Its slope-back tender carried 4,500 gallons of water, plus 6 tons of coal when fully loaded. With its 51-inch diameter driving wheels, the locomotive could exert a maximum tractive effort of 34,400 pounds. It was equipped with Walshert valve gear and superheaters, and its boiler operating pressure, as delivered, was 180 pounds per square inch. It's not known where locomotive 4455 was first assigned, but the UP had dozens of these 060 workhorses stationed at terminals and yards throughout its system. As a coal burner, its territory would have ranged from Omaha and Kansas City on the east to Denver and Cheyenne and westward to Salt Lake City and Ogden, Utah, even into the Pacific Northwest. UP's Los Angeles and Salt Lake route to Southern California, and its far western lines in Oregon and Washington all used oil as fuel rather than coal, so we know the locomotive didn't operate in those regions. As is often the case, this unremarkable life meant that photos were rarely captured of the locomotive. The museum has yet to find images of the 4455 in service during its first 15 or so years of operation. Sometime around the mid-1930s, locomotive 4455 was assigned to service in Denver. From that point forward, the locomotive appears to have stayed put until the end of its Union Pacific service life. The little steam switcher could be found switching freight and passenger equipment in the railroad's Pullman shops and yards north of Denver Union Station, as well as switching in and around Denver Union Station itself. This gave the locomotive a public visibility that many other locomotives, especially switchers, might never have had. Because of their visibility, switching locomotives used in larger passenger terminals were usually kept clean and well maintained. Several Union Pacific switchers in particularly busy terminals were even embellished with shiny cylinder head covers and nickel-plated driving rods. Number 4455 was not among this special group of locomotives, but its appearance seems to have been neat and tidy whenever it was caught on film in Denver. In the annals of railroad history, Denver is unique for many things. Among these is the fact that its competing railroad companies organized to plan and construct a Union passenger station some 10 years after the first train entered the city, which is unusual. Completed in 1887, this grand new facility boasted an elaborate depot building spanning 500 feet in length, adorned by a complex roofline topped off with a central 180-foot clock tower. The station held the distinction of being the tallest building in the West when it first opened. From a railroad operations standpoint, turnouts, originally stub switches, soon changed to the more reliable split switch design, were thrown by hand for each train movement. This first Union station served Denver for some 13 years until, in 1894, an electrical fire quickly swept the building, destroying the central hall and the iconic clock tower. The ruins were still smoking as activity returned trackside, given Union Station's central importance to the Queen City of the Plains. The depot was quickly rebuilt, with a new roofline and an even more impressive tower. At that same time, nearly all of the station's tracks were dual-gauged to allow for operation of both standard and narrow-gauge trains. Otherwise, things remained much the same operationally. Early steam switchers could often be found hard at work, making up and breaking up trains in and around Denver Union Station. Denver continued to expand in both population and influence in the early 20th century, leading to increases in the number of passengers and trains calling on Union Station. U.S. Postal Service inner-city mail volume was also increasing, handled exclusively by trains. Not surprisingly, city interests pressured the railroads to once again improve and expand Union Station. Work began in 1914, with the end result being a completely new central section fashioned in classical Beaux-Art style, joined to the original depot wings and their 1894 roofline, which remained. The work extended way beyond the depot building itself. New baggage and passenger subways were constructed to reduce at-grade conflicts with trains. Tracks were completely rebuilt and equipped with new train shed canopies for protection from the weather. The number of tracks was expanded, with an all-new system of interlocking towers, block signals, and automatically thrown track switches controlling train movements between 11th and 31st Streets in downtown Denver. 2 brick control towers were built to house the major interlocking switch and signal machinery. The towers were operated by employees of the Denver Union Terminal Railway Company, jointly owned by Denver's major railroads, including Union Pacific. A new turning loop was even constructed along the depot's southeast face to allow streetcars from the Denver tramway system to more efficiently move patrons to and from Union Station. Union Pacific 060 number 4455 appears to have been assigned to this important and busy scene sometime in the mid-1930s. Not only did the locomotive serve in and around Union Station, it also would pull passenger consists to and from the Union Pacific coach yards located north of the station. In addition, number 4455 switched freight cars and other rolling stock in and around Union Pacific's Pullman yards, roundhouse, and shop facilities, one of the major railroad installations in downtown Denver dating back to the 1870s. The late 1930s were a time of transition for America's railroads. As the decade began, passenger trains calling at Denver Union Station were typically made up of steel heavyweight cars, along with Harriman-era designs featuring curved roofs. Dual-gauge tracks still extended into the station, used by quaint passenger trains operating on the Colorado and Southern narrow gauge until 1937. Just 1 year before this final Denver narrow gauge service was abandoned, in 1936, Union Pacific introduced its streamlined City of Denver passenger train. The Burlington route almost simultaneously rolled out its sleek stainless steel Denver Zephyr. Locomotive 4455 and its classmates were hard at work, performing their usual duties throughout all of these changes. As the troubled winds of World War II gusted more strongly, freight and passenger traffic levels increased for Colorado's railroads. Union Station saw increasing numbers of service personnel boarding trains or passing through en route to training posts, or even to active duty on the war's many fronts. With the Allied victory achieved in 1945, America's railroads launched into the next transition, dieselizing not just fast passenger trains, but nearly all freight and passenger trains over the next decade. The steam locomotives performing switching duties at yards and terminals would be no exception. In the meantime, however, Union Pacific would make small changes to its steam switcher fleet. First was the application of a new, bolder, and more modern style of lettering to match the railroad's fleet of streamliners. This was followed shortly by a change in the location of the headlights, from atop the smokebox to a location right in the middle of the smokebox front, replacing what had been a round number plate previously. A new rectangular cast shelf to hold up the new headlights would feature each locomotive's number, consisting of individual cast numerals affixed just underneath. Within just a few years, the Union Pacific Railroad began retiring its fleet of steam-powered 060s in favor of diesel switchers, which by now had proven their abilities and were much cheaper and easier to maintain. Many 060s would be scrapped in the 1940s and 1950s, thus ending their service and becoming only memories. Others were donated to cities along the Union Pacific system for static display. A lucky few, however, would go on to have second careers with other railroads. This is what would happen in 1949 to Switcher 4455, when it was sold to Wyoming's Laramie Valley Railroad. A new chapter was about to begin. The Laramie Valley Railroad had been constructed in 1928 and 1929. It was a cement railroad, hauling shale rock with a fairly high limestone content from quarries alongside the Laramie River, just 8.9 miles to a cement plant located just south of Laramie, Wyoming. Interestingly, the cement plant was within the limits of what had once been the Fort Sanders Military Reservation, a frontier garrison built in 1866 to protect construction crews of the Union Pacific as they built the nation's first transcontinental railroad. Since its inception, the cement company and its Laramie Valley Railroad had a close relationship with Union Pacific Railroad. The Little Rock Hauling Railroad's first steam locomotive was a second-hand UP 060 dating from the 1880s. Its second locomotive, a much more modern 1906 vintage 060, was purchased from Union Pacific within a year of the railroad's opening, and a third former UP 060 was added to the company's roster in the 1930s. The railroad's fortunes were tied to construction trends, of course, and its first decade was challenging because of the Great Depression. It saw record carloads of rock hauled in 1939, then World War II caused production to once again drop to about half. But the post-war boom changed the company's fortunes, and traffic levels grew so quickly that new rock cars were needed, and soon another locomotive as well. This time it was 060 switcher number 4455 that was sold to the company. The little 060 was moved to Wyoming, joining the Laramie Valley fleet and starting a whole new career. This career was much less glamorous than its time on the Union Pacific. There, the 4455 had been kept clean and shiny, and it was always busy shunting trains around in the rail yards surrounding bustling downtown Denver. In Wyoming, although its new owner did not change its number, Locomotive 4455 quickly became dirty and shop-worn. Its workdays consisted of leading a train of empties to the quarry, then returning with a fully loaded train later in the day after the cars had been filled by large mechanized shovels. Former Union Pacific switcher 4455 enjoyed a fairly lengthy career on the Laramie Valley Railroad. In 1955, it was joined by yet another former Union Pacific switcher from Denver, number 4453. Just a couple years later, the cement railroad's tracks were extended by about 1.5 miles in order to reach a new rock quarry. Together, the pair of 060 switchers pulled rock trains to the monolith Portland Midwest Cement Company plant for the next decade or so. By the late 1960s, number 4455 was the only steam locomotive still in service on the Laramie Valley Railroad. The larger tender from one of its siblings had replaced its original slope-back tender by this time, causing some confusion as to which locomotive was which among rail enthusiasts.
Spare parts were getting hard to find to keep steam locomotives running, so sibling 4453 was cannibalized to keep the 4455 in operation.
In 1967, the little 060 ventured onto Union Pacific rails in Laramie during a special occasion for the railroad. Fresh paint was even applied for the occasion. Just 1 year later, a second-hand General Electric 70-ton diesel-electric locomotive was purchased, placing number 4455 into standby status. Its days as an operating steam locomotive were numbered. A brief respite took place in 1970, with the little 060 returning to service that summer for a few short weeks while the company's diesel locomotive received a major overhaul. During that time, the Colorado Midland chapter of the National Railway Historical Society arranged for a special excursion train to run over the line. Since the only cars on the railroad were flat cars with buckets, railroad enthusiasts climbed aboard them using tall ladders. At the conclusion of the trip, the train crew presented the raised numbers from 4455's front number plate to chapter members as a special memento. Once the Laramie Valley's now shiny diesel returned from its overhaul that fall, the little steam switcher went back into standby service. It would never again operate, as its diesel replacement was quite reliable. 2 years later, once proud locomotive number 4455 was permanently retired from service. Although it was a sad occasion, the little 060 had achieved a special status as one of the very last steam locomotives operating commercially in the West. And now that chapter of its life had come to an end, with the scrap heap as the likely next step. A fortunate turn of events was soon announced, however. Monolith Portland Cement donated switcher number 4455 to the Colorado Railroad Museum in September 1972. Its original slope-back tender was switched out from the deadline to rejoin the engine, once again making for an historically complete locomotive. Union Pacific agreed to donate transportation from Wyoming so the locomotive could make its way to Golden. And the original front letterboard numbers were donated to the museum soon afterwards by the Colorado Midland chapter. Loaded up on 2 flat cars in fall 1972, with the engine on one and its tender on a second, rather beat-up looking 4455 was pictured at the Wyoming cement plant before its move. Once in Denver, another historic rail vehicle destined for the museum joined the move, former Colorado and Southern rotary snowplow 99201. The final leg of the journey to Golden would occur on Burlington Northern trackage, formerly part of the Colorado and Southern. The curious train was photographed as it made its way along the branch line toward Golden and the Coors Brewery. The destination was a short spur track, located at that time across West 44th Avenue from the museum. This spur was a remnant from 1963, when Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy 484 steam locomotive number 5629 was moved into the museum. Following the subsequent 1973 move to Golden, the spur track was left in place, but the connection to the BNSF Railroad was removed. This disconnected spur track would now hold 060 number 4455, the rotary snowplow, and a standard gauge tank car that was pushed in before the switch was removed. These 3 rail vehicles would call this unusual location home for the next 35 years. At first, the idea was for these rail vehicles to serve as a giant billboard, beckoning automobiles off newly completed Colorado Highway 58. But the reality was that they weren't terribly visible, and their awkward location meant they could not be easily seen by museum visitors either. The locomotive, snowplow, and tank car languished until finally, in January 2008, all 3 were trucked across the street to the museum. There, they were placed on newly laid display track, adjacent to the area where the museum's pavilion building would be constructed in the future. A cosmetic restoration project was soon launched to make the locomotive and the rotary snowplow suitable for display. As part of the overhaul, the locomotive was backdated to its pre-World War II appearance, featuring Roman numerals and lettering, a number plate centered on the front of the smokebox, and the headlight once again perched atop the smokebox. This meant the letters from its later smokebox front headlight shelf would not be reapplied. Instead, they have been retained in the museum's smaller artifact collections, illustrating the changes that take place to locomotives over time. Today, Union Pacific Railroad switcher 4455 is exhibited in a high visibility location at the museum, adjacent to the newly upgraded Polar Express Pavilion and a freshly laid paved pathway providing guests with an accessible all-weather route to the museum's Cornelius Hauck Roundhouse facility. The little standard gauge 060 remains a tangible link to Denver's railroading heyday, and a Colorado railroading icon that served a long and interesting life both inside and outside the Centennial State. Thanks for joining me today. Union Pacific Railroad steam switcher number 4455 does not have a glamorous history, but it does provide a window into a very different downtown Denver. One filled with bustling railroads, railroad freight and passenger coach yards, and railroad shop facilities. Together with the ongoing parade of trains that once passed through Union Station, this was a very different place from today's downtown scene. And this was one of the very last steam locomotives operating in the West, with its final service taking place as late as 1970. Today, a number of other 060 locomotives are preserved across the U.S., including several Union Pacific examples. At the museum, other artifacts that relate to the 4455's story can also be found, including a signal that once guarded the entrance to the trackage limits of the Denver Union Terminal Railway. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Union Pacific Standard Gauge Steam Switcher number 4455 today, and I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.